This is the Hanging Temple, an extraordinary site built into the cliffside of Mount Heng in China's Shaanxi province. At first glance, it appears to be just another ancient Buddhist temple, perched dramatically on wooden beams high above the ground. But there's much more to it than meets the eye. Built around 500 CE, the Hanging Temple is not only an architectural marvel, but also a symbol of religious blending. Inside the Hall of Three Religions, you can find statues of Confucius, Lao Tzu, and of course, the Buddha. This blending of traditions is known as syncretism. Syncretism occurs when different belief systems and cultural practices merge and interact, creating new ways of understanding the world. And that's what we'll be looking at today. Welcome, curious souls! Today, we'll explore how Buddhism adapted to local customs and traditions as it traveled through China, Korea, and Japan. Much like the Hanging Temple, where three distinct traditions coexist, Buddhism transformed and integrated with local beliefs, creating a rich and complex spiritual landscape across East Asia. Are you ready to begin? Let's go! Buddhism first arrived in East Asia, here in China. Merchants and monks traveling the Silk Road first brought Buddhism to China around the 2nd century CE. But it wasn't until the 6th century that Buddhism began to flourish with the support of the ruling Tang dynasty. Though there were periods of official persecution of Buddhism, the imperial court supported the construction of Buddhist temples and monasteries. This support definitely helped spread Buddhist ideas throughout the empire, but it wasn't just imperial support that made that spread possible. For Buddhism to truly take root in China, it had to adapt to the existing religions. Remember, at this time, both Confucianism and Taoism were already deeply embedded in Chinese society. Now, think about how Buddhism's ideas, such as the focus on individual enlightenment, renunciation of worldly attachments, and the monastic lifestyle, might have seemed unfamiliar or difficult to explain in this context. Buddhist monks had to make their beliefs more relatable to a society so strongly influenced by Confucian and Taoist ideas. How might concepts like Wu Wei in Taoism or filial piety in Confucianism be used to help explain Buddhist ideas? Well, monks and early translators of Buddhist texts had to draw on Taoist and Confucian ideas that were more familiar to Chinese people. For example, they often used Taoist concepts like Wu Wei or non-action to explain the Buddhist idea of avoiding attachment. This allowed people to understand Buddhism through a lens they were already familiar with. Buddhism in China even adopted Confucian values like filial piety, respect for one's parents and ancestors, helping it resonate more deeply with Chinese family-centered values. Over time, Buddhist practices and teachings in China began to reflect Chinese cultural values. This adaptation allowed Buddhism to resonate more deeply with Chinese society. Many Chinese people were drawn to the focus on meditation and personal enlightenment in Buddhism, rather than rituals or scriptures. So, Buddhism was clearly different, but also complementary to Taoist and Confucian teachings. Eventually, new schools of thought developed, including Chan Buddhism, which blended Buddhist teachings with Taoist philosophy. Today, fewer than 10% of Chinese adults identify strictly as Buddhists, but interestingly, nearly a third say they believe in the Buddha or practice some form of Buddhist rituals. And over 70% identify with what we call Chinese folk religion, which can be any combination of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and local traditions. But whether or not people call themselves Buddhists, Buddhist beliefs and practices became a lasting part of Chinese spiritual life. Okay, let's see where we are now. Oh, this is the Bulguksa Temple, one of Korea's most revered Buddhist sites. If you look closely, you'll notice something more than just Buddhist symbolism here. There are subtle hints at Korea's spiritual roots embedded in the architecture and art. Temple designs often incorporate animals and symbols from nature. At this shrine in Ganghwa, you can see a tiger, considered a protector of the mountains. In the next panel, you can see a dragon, considered the guardian of the land and water. These are important symbols from indigenous spiritual traditions. These traditions are called shamanism. Shamanism in Korea focuses on the worship of nature deities and the spirits of the ancestors. Shamanistic rituals often focus on maintaining harmony and balance between humans and nature. Most Koreans who continue these shamanistic practices today actually identify as Buddhists. But how did that happen? Well, Buddhism arrived in Korea from China in the 4th century CE. Like in China, it was heavily influenced by Confucianism and initially supported by the royal court. Kings and nobles saw Buddhism as a way to strengthen their authority and unify the people under a shared spiritual tradition. But again, Buddhism didn't spread without adapting to Korean culture. Can you think of any similarities between Buddhism and shamanism that might make them compatible? Well, Buddhist ideas about harmony and balance in life made it easy to coexist and integrate with shamanistic ideas. As Buddhism spread in Korea, it began to incorporate shamanistic practices. Buddhist temples held ceremonies to honor local mountain gods, whose shrines can often be found alongside statues of the Buddha. These practices helped Buddhism feel familiar to the Korean people. So, you can see how Buddhism in Korea adapted to the native culture, blending with the shamanistic traditions that had long defined the spiritual life of the Korean people. Buddhism continued to journey eastward to Japan, where it encountered a whole new set of beliefs and practices. Now this looks like a torii gate, so we must be in Japan. Let's head in and look around. This is the Kasuga Shrine in Nara, Japan. I wonder how Buddhism had to adapt when it came to Japan. By the 6th century, Buddhism had reached Japan, largely through Korean influence, and it quickly gained favor with the elite class. The imperial court embraced Buddhism and used it as a symbol of their status and spirituality. Of course, when Buddhism first arrived in Japan, there was already a vibrant native spiritual tradition. That was Shinto, or Shintoism, which focused on nature spirits, or kami. Buddhism did not immediately catch on with most people in Japan. To increase its appeal, Buddhist monks aimed to blend with Shinto beliefs rather than replacing them. What do you think might have happened if they tried to replace Shinto instead? Well, Shinto was deeply tied to Japanese culture and traditions, so trying to replace it could have led to resistance and rejection. By integrating with existing beliefs, Buddhism was able to coexist and eventually flourish. And kami were not incompatible with Buddhist beliefs. In some cases, kami and bodhisattvas were considered manifestations of the same spirit. Take a look at this mandala from the Kasuga Shrine. The bottom row depicts representations of Japanese kami. Now, if you follow the cloud upward, you'll see Buddhist bodhisattvas that are associated with each kami. This connection between the kami and bodhisattvas shows how Japanese spiritual beliefs were merged. Shinto spirits were seen as earthly forms of Buddhist bodhisattvas. This fusion of beliefs allowed Buddhism to become an integral part of Japanese spiritual life. With its emphasis on meditation, discipline, and simplicity, Zen Buddhism, imported from Chan Buddhism in China, found a particularly strong following in Japan. Zen's influence continues to shape many aspects of Japanese culture, including tea ceremonies, rock gardens, and even the martial arts. By blending with Shinto traditions, Buddhism became deeply ingrained in Japanese culture and spiritual life. Oh, it looks like we've arrived back at the Library of Faith. As we've seen today, Buddhism's journey from India to China, Korea, and Japan is a story of transformation. As it spread, it adapted to local cultures, philosophies, and traditions. Through this process of adaptation, Buddhism didn't just survive, it thrived, becoming a core part of the spiritual lives of millions across East Asia. In our next lesson, we'll look back at all the connections and comparisons between the religions of East Asia. Until then, stay curious, friends.
Hey!